I would like to start this constructive speech by pointing out that nowhere in Jeff's affirmative constructive does he propose a plan for the banning of video games glorifying gun violence. He delves into a discussion of violent video games' responsibility in modifications of behavior and makes numerous claims that I will individually address shortly. What is lacking in Jeff's speech, as in the argument for the ban on video games glorifying gun violence in general, is a legitimate plan that will substantially solve what proponents view as a problem. Note that I do not agree that there is a problem with the status quo. I am simply pointing out the perplexity of a proposition that has an issue with the status quo but fails to address how to solve these problems. In a June 28, 2011 New York Times article, writer Seth Scheisel summarizes the status of video games in the United States when he writes, and I quote, "It is now the law of the United States that video games are an art." The article goes on to quote Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia in writing, quote, "that suffices to confer First Amendment protection. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Citing the Constitution, the basis of all law of the United States of America, a ban of video games in any regard would be a direct violation of the First Amendment. Jeff claims that, and I quote, "thousands of documented scientific studies have conclusively shown that playing violent video games correlates with an increase in test subjects' violent and aggressive behavior," end quote. Please note the lack of citation. Dr. Lawrence Kuttner and Dr. Cheryl K. Olson, co-directors of the Harvard Medical School Center for Mental Health and Media, state, and I quote, "much of the information in the popular press about the effects of violent video games is wrong," close quotes, in the April 28, 2008 Toronto Star. This statement is prefaced in the article with false information portrayed by popular media about links between school shootings and violent video games, antisocial behavior in violent video games, and the use of video games to train for real-life violence. All these links are strewn out conclusions with little basis in factual evidence, according to Dr. Kuttner and Dr. Olson. In response to the claim that the well-known Columbine high school shooters, Harold and Klebold, their motives had anything to do with video games, I would like to quote the previous article again that states, open quotes, "It is unlikely that Harris and Klebold's interests in violent video games or other violent media played any significant role in their actions," close quotes. Later in the article, it is stated that, and I quote, "only 1 in 8 school shooters showed any interest in violent video games," close quotes. It is impossible for me to concede a statistically relevant correlation between school shootings and video games glorifying gun violence when only 12.5% of shooters expressed even any interest in violent video games. Around 3 minutes into Jeff's speech, he brings up gun control laws and their relevance to this debate. I would like to contend that nowhere in the resolution is there mention of physical guns or of gun control problems. Jeff speaks of, and I quote, "some analysts in the United States," close quotes, "thoughts on Norwegian gun control laws," in a sentence that seems out of place in this debate and leads to no further point on why or how video games glorifying gun violence should be banned. Let me remind you, the resolution has nothing to do with Norwegian gun control legislation. Jeff uses the argument that those who wish to commit violent acts with a gun, specifically murder, would obtain a gun by any means, be it legal or illegal. This claim is in direct contradiction with his illogical point on a need for stricter gun control. Additionally, I would like to implement a thought exercise in which this logic is applied to violent video games. If a person truly wants to obtain and play games that glorify gun violence, following Jeff's own logic, that person would use any methods available to do so. This is not as straightforward as the purchase of a physical, legal firearm. Nonetheless, the reasoning is actually more applicable here. Hypothetically, obtaining a video game that has been banned would be very easy using the internet. A number of different facets online could be exploited to copy and distribute banned games. For instance, torrents, emailing zip files, or programmers coding their own games online for distribution. In a Forbes August 2012 article, a research group specializing in video games known as DFC Intelligence reports that by 2017, 39% of content will be distributed online. 39% of video game content will be distributed online. This is further evidence of the logistical futility involved in any form of video game ban. I would like to conclude my speech with a recap of points I've made. In no place does my opponent propose a legitimate, sensible plan for the ban of video games glorifying gun violence. He disregards the U.S. Constitution and, by association, the entire legal system of the United States. He makes claims that have no substantial backing in evidence and contradict and oppose directly evidence I have provided. He unreasonably makes statements about gun control laws and, finally, contradicts his own logic. From my opponent's speech and my own, there is no conclusion that can be drawn that a ban on video games glorifying gun violence should be put into effect.